But Bowling, of course, who knows that the insurance game is nothing more than a swindle with a smile, feels little pity for the working classes. And although he recognizes that, quote, the proles suffer physically, he's a free man when he isn't working, he laments his inability to cast off his own shackles and explode those stucco boxes where resides that poor bastard who's never free. However, what remains of interest with Bowling is the fact that in the gilded cage of stucco, chromium, the plastic nightmare, all the Tory yes men, all of that, is that he desires to come to consciousness again. He desires to experience, without irony or cynicism, the vitality that was quashed by the reification of the middle class here. But this is doomed, as it will always be with the middle class, for the middle class are not people, for Orwell. The travesty of middle class well-offness is the fact that underneath the stucco exterior, the cressuated gate, the green front door, the laurels, the myrtles, the hawthorns, is the tyranny of worry, the unending fear that the whole of being teeters on a precipice, and that all could be sent to the workhouse in an instant. The fear of the workhouse is not simply about losing security and money, as we know. On the contrary, the fear of the workhouse is the fear of being divorced from the money code and the snobism and faux airs that it allows here. So the money code's not about money. I think that's clear. It's an ethos where one keeps up with the Joneses, where one keeps up appearances, but with a great price. The absence of laughter, the destruction of joy, programmed apathy to the world outside, the frailness of human bonds. These are amongst the most salient features of the code's impingement on freedom. And of course, if you look at middle-class families, the fact that families are not really families. They're not familial at all. There's a coldness between parents and children and lovers and husbands and so on and so forth that comes with this here. But all the while, again, the gate. So a great irony is found in the fact that while middle-class life offers a decent standard of living, it compounds this by engendering a sordid standard of emotional, psychic, and interior life, which can only be articulated, as in the case of George Bowling, through the dual vectors of disgust and nostalgia here. So modernity is a site of loss, right? Not only of consciousness and vitality, but of real sausages, real teeth, and indeed nature. Bowling's only solace comes in his wistful recollections of those idyllic days of fishing in Binfield, where things were no less different than the present, but where the world had not developed into the pseudo-newness of simulacrum and imagined authenticity. To the lakes that he swam in as a youth, he counters the lakes of fear that the European middle class swim in now, where everyone that isn't scared stiff of losing his job is scared stiff of the war, of fascism, or communism, or something here. The lakes of Binfield, in other words, were sites of pastoral continuity that were invaded by the rupture of modern war culture and the invention of the modern middle class, where no one fishes but fights for good prospects, while all the while disavowing the fact that civilizational progress was indeed a regression into barbarism. Fishing is the opposite of war, as Orwell reminds us. We should just add a nuance here. There are still people in England who fish, by the way. Fishing is the opposite of war. Fishing is the opposite of stucco. But the fact of the matter is this is not about fishing at all, as we know. This is about modernity's fall into a period of flux, into a period of liquidness, into environmental degradation, general equivalence and relativism, all tinged with the fear of war and destitution. In groundless times, the middle class may have leisure time, but not the political and moral categories through which to reflect in any meaningful way on politics. Again, everyone in front of their television set, right? And what happens when Bowling goes back to Binfield? What happens when he goes home? Well, he doesn't find nature. He doesn't find the authentic. He finds kitsch. He finds plastic. He finds a series of misrecognitions. Wendy at the tea shop doesn't care if he lived in Bowling. He goes back home. His wife doesn't even know that he was ever interested in fishing and thinks he's been with a prostitute. So political wisdom cannot be found. And Orwell does use the term political wisdom in the English people. Political wisdom no longer reigns in Binfield, and to those whom Bowling ascribed authenticity, they no longer recognize him. So embarking on a minor binge where he puts on 4 pounds in 3 days, he seeks out the pool at the Binfield house only to find that horrible nightmare of suburban children with their sailboats and the sign that reads Upper Binfield Yacht Club here. Comstock is a different story, of course. For him, political consciousness could only be attained by severing all ties with the money code to go, a code that he is indeed imprinted with. But there's a tension in Comstock Comstock strategy as there is in Bowlby's. The fact that the quest for political consciousness is melded into a highly personal, and thus strangely apolitical, quest to simply purge one's being of conformism and the viruses of middle-class life that breed slackening and exhaustion. Comstock and those like him cared little about politics at all. He simply did not want to work, and whether the latter decision was informed by bohemian whimsy or by a radical and concrete protest against alienation, we can only speculate. These tensions, epitomized by Comstock's own ambivalence towards socialism, further problematized the degree to which Orwell, of course the assistant in the Hampstead bookshop, understood political consciousness to be an internal enterprise or a real social project. We're never quite out of that dilemma here. If it is a real social project, as certainly Orwell believed, the snobbery and violence of the middle class and the money code can only be countered with the snobbery and violence of the transgressor of the money code, who nonetheless accepts late capitalism as the end of history. Hence, the attainment of political consciousness remains impossible by neither the lower middle class salesman nor the transgressive dropout, and the bourgeois intellectual mired in that faith as well is of no help here. It can only paradoxically be achieved with the absolute destruction of the divide between the moneyed and the non-moneyed, a destruction which would take the form of the socialism that Bowling and Comstock's scoff at, and that the bourgeois intellectual Ravelston or Sir Richard Rees only flirts with here. In other words, the people lie beyond these antinomies. And the problematic reading of Orwell is to think his work through these kind of standard antinomies, where he's trying to desperately get out of them at the same time here. To this analysis, and stretching the point a bit, Burmese days can also be added. Here, the absence of the working class has a different practical basis. But the imaginative rupture, which misleadingly leads the middle class to identify with their betters rather than with their unrecognized peers, is similar. There's considerable warrant throughout Orwell's writings for the view that he regarded racism, in the current sense of the word, which is anachronistic in Orwell's own vocabulary, and snobbery as having strong similarities in imaginative structure, in material basis such as smells and social effects.